like to call to order our SEAC meeting for Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. And for the people joining us online, welcome. This meeting will run from 6:30 till 7:30 p.m., at which time we will adjourn. There is a second meeting that's occurring from 7:30 to 8:30, but that will be a planning session for SEAC and will not be live streamed. Okay, I will start with the land acknowledgement. The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. I'll move on to our human rights and Indigenous rights statement. The Durham District School Board recognizes Indigenous rights are distinct. In the exercise of those rights, Indigenous staff and students shall not be subject to action with the aim or effect of depriving these distinct rights. The Durham District School Board is committed to learning and working environments that center human rights and equity and are safe, welcoming, respectful, equitable, accessible, inclusive, and free from discrimination. Okay, and did we receive any regrets? Lisa?
Yes, sorry. Elizabeth Daniel and Charmaine Brown.
Okay, so we have regrets from Elizabeth Daniels and Charmaine Brown. We will move on to our roll call. Tara Kelly, Durham Done Association.
Donna Evers, trustee AJAX.
Kelly Miller, trustee AJAX.
Joan Jarvis, Learning Student Association.
Morgan Cameron, member at large.
Yes. I wasn't listening. Censoring that brow, I just material.
Joan McLaughlin, Council Donna. Andrea McCauley, Superintendent of Inclusive Student Services. Jennifer Major, Senior Manager of Finance. Lisa Rye, Recording Secretary.
Michelle Property and System Lead, Inclusive Student Services. Eva Kiriakis, Association for Bright Children, and SEAC Chair. We will move on then to the approval of the agenda. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at the agenda for tonight's meeting? We get a motion. Is there any questions or concerns with the agenda? Okay, we get a motion to approve. Tara, seconded by Donna, all in favor? Okay, motion passed. Then we'll move on to our item number 6, which is our presentation with respect to special education funding. And there is information on front of you with respect to that.
So more from Jen, a familiar case to many around SEAC. At this time, we do not yet have 24-25 funding from the Ministry of Education. So the information that Jen will be sharing this evening is the foundations of which the current school year sits on, and some of our priorities funds that we know of at this time. And so Jen's going to do a walkthrough of that. But we do plan this meeting sometimes around the release of the GSX, which we have not yet received at this time. And so welcome and thank you for your expertise.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for having me tonight. I always look forward to this meeting to kind of share the funding model and answering questions you might have about it. So just have a little agenda for you tonight. We'll start it with some key terms that drive the funding, talk specifically about the special education grant, the supports for students funding that has a special education component, discuss some of the priorities and partnerships funding. Those are grants that we receive for specific purposes, talking about the use of our accumulated surplus over the special education reserve, and have a look at specific numbers for 2023-24 special education funding. And then I just have some additional information about upcoming meetings that we have regarding the budget. Great, so as we're talking funding, one of the big drivers is enrollment. And so when we're talking about funding, it refers to the number of students attending our schools, and it really drives our revenue and our expenditure calculations. So the ministry determines funding for our school boards through calculations using average daily enrollment, and I'll define that below. We use official enrollment projections when we're talking about enrollment for budget, And those are the enrollment estimates that are developed by our property and planning department. And so inputs received from schools and principals as to what their enrollment will look like for the next year. When we talk about full-time equivalent, it's a calculation of student enrollment taking into consideration part-time students. So a full-time student is 1 FTE, however, a part-time student could be equal to a portion of the school day when they're attending class. Average daily enrollment is the average of the FTE counts on October 31st and March 31st, and that is the number that is used for the funding. Our grants for student needs is the Ministry of Education allocation provided to all school boards, consisting of the Pupil Foundation Grant, the School Foundation Grant, and 16 special purpose grants, and one of those is the Special Education Grant. So the Special Education Grant is the component of DSM which supports students with special education needs, and it's enveloped in that it may only be used for special education programs, services, and equipment. Any unspent funding is put aside and must be spent on special education in the future. It's the minimum amount that must be spent, but certainly school boards are able to spend more than the special education grant on special education programs. So currently it's made up of 6 allocations: special education per pupil amount, SEPA, differentiated special education needs amount, SENA, special equipment amount, SEAC, special incidents portion, SIP, the Education and Community Partnership Program, and the Behavior Expertise amount. And I'll go through all those individually and explain them. So to start with the special education per pupil amount, or SEPA. So this is to assist with cost providing additional support to students with special education needs, and it's based on total enrollment. This particular portion of the grant is based on total enrollment, not just identified students, and it's allocated on the basis of our total ADE, or average daily enrollment, multiplied by a benchmark rate. And so I've just, again, as Andrew mentioned, we don't have 2024-25 numbers yet, but I've just put in current year and prior year so you can see the variance year over year. And at the end, towards the end of the presentation, I'll show you the totals, what was generated by our board. So the next portion of the grant is differentiated special education needs amount. And so this is not just based on our total enrollment, it's trying to address variation amongst the school boards. And it does it using 6 different components. The first being special education statistical prediction model. And so it's based on neighborhood profiles and it's predicted percentages based on those profiles. The measures of variability. And so this looks at the number of students receiving special education programs and services, and credit accumulation and participation in non-credit courses, and Indigenous adjustment, remote and rural adjustment. So again, just taking into consideration some variability between boards. There's a base amount for collaboration and integration. So every board receives this. It's base funding of $492,000. Then we have multidisciplinary supports, and it has 2 components: the multidisciplinary team component and other staffing resources component. There's a allocation portion for local special education priorities. That's base funding plus an ADE multiplier. So base funding of $113,000 and 4.24 per ADE. And that's for additional educational or professional and paraprofessional staff or other local priorities. New this year in the DSM grant is the early math intervention amount. And that again is base funding and a multiplier per ADE. And that may be used for instructional staff or resources. A special equipment amount. So this is to support the purchase of equipment required by students with special education needs. So we do get a per pupil amount. So again, total ADE multiplied by a benchmark rate, as well as a base amount for each school board, which is $20,000. And then we also have claim-based funding, which is much more significant. And so that's to cover the cost of non-computer based equipment needs, less a deductible of $800 per year. The special incidents portion supports those students that require more than 2 full-time staff. And this funding is interesting. They've changed the model this year to be based on historical funding amounts with a growth rate of 5. So we don't have specific details on how that's going to be calculated in the future, if they're going to keep this model, but this is the first year they've used this funding model. ECPP is Education and Community Partnership Program allocation. So this is to provide education programs to children and youth in care, treatment, or detention facilities. And this funding is based on an approval process specified in the guideline. And it basically revenue and expenditures have to equal. So if we don't, if it will reduce our revenue if the projected amount approved is greater than the actual final expenditure incurred. So we don't carry any of those funds forward if they're not used. The behavior expertise amount is to provide funding to hire professional staff who have expertise in applied behavior analysis. It's made up of three components: the expertise professionals amount, the ABA training amount, and the after-school skills development amount. So supports for students funding is outside of the special education portion of the funding, and it was implemented as a result of labor negotiations. So it has been extended for the current year, and then funding beyond this year is part of the bargaining process. I was hoping to have details for you today on it, but I unfortunately don't, but we will bring that as part of the budget process. So I just wanted to point out this year, it's $1.7 million, and it supports 29 educational assistant positions. Priorities and partnerships fund grants, PPF grants, are generally provided by the ministry, but could be provided by any third party. And they're grants that we get that are for a specific purpose. So they generally come with a transfer payment agreement and really specifically outline how we can use the funds. So it's additional funding outside the grant student needs, maybe one time only, or in pace for a limited period of time. It's governed by agreements. Any unspent grants are to be returned. So similar to the ECPP, if we don't spend all the money, it needs to be returned. And at times it can be transferred into the GSN. So that math intervention component I was mentioning was new this year. Last year was actually a PPF grant that they've rolled up into the grants for student needs this year. So I just thought I'd point out a few of the grants that we have this year that may be of interest to this group. The professional assessments and systematic evidence-based reading programs, removing barriers for students with disabilities, licenses for reading intervention supports, special education additional qualification courses, and summer learning for students with special education needs. And I've just put the 23-24 amounts there in case anyone is interested. So this year we've also used accumulated surplus from the special education reserve. So we had a draw of $120,000 from the reserve, and that's the final draw. We've used for the past few years, we've drawn from this reserve. So this is the final amount to come out, and we've used it to support 8-week in-class support positions, so educational assistant roles. So this is just a summary of kind of all the grants that I just talked about and how much we generated as a board. So as you can see, as of revised estimates, pardon me, got caught up, my apologies, it's the third column there. You can see we have a $2.6 million deficit on special education spending, which is actually down from where we were estimates, which was just under $3 million. And that was as a result of increased enrollment overall, generates increased special education funding. So you can see that our special education allocation went up by about $1.8 million. Great, thank you. So I just want to point out our scheduled education finance meetings, our public meetings. The first one is coming up on April 16th for public deputations. And on May 15th, we hope to have a presentation of the draft budget. So hopefully we get those GSN soon so we can calculate the budget for you. And then we have another date for deputations on May 28th. And on June 5th, we hope to have a budget consideration and recommendation to board for the June 17th board meeting. Happy to answer any questions anyone has on the grants, on the budget process.
Not a question. I have to make a comment, of course. And just some highlights that as years going through this, used to be on the SEAC, as chair of SEAC representing two associations, I used to give presentations to the board on budget. I read the GSN when they come in. It's a huge document, and it's a technical document. And what still bothers me, that just to point out the things that still exist in this document today, and I don't see it changing. One is that the whole thing about the special education pupil amount is the cost of providing additional support. So basically they're saying that, here's your special education envelopes, but if you need additional support, this is where you go to, and it's still a very small amount if you look for the amount per student. And when they look at the increase, if you look at the variance, it doesn't even meet the increased costs of laborers negotiated through contracts. I mean, so that's one of the biggest things that they have to look at. The fact that the measures of availability, I still get onto this, is that it uses basically EQAO assessments. It was never, EQAO was never supposed to be tied to funding for students, yet for students with disabilities or students with special needs, it is tied to that. And not only that, the marker is that if they reach level 2, so it's okay for our students not to reach level 3. You know, which is the provincial standard.
It's okay, our kids are okay to be subpar.
Yeah, our kids are already, so when I look at that, it's always an inequity that drives me around the bend, as well as the prediction model that is used. Not all the data is up to date. Some of the data is, I think 1990.
I thought 2006, but you might be right.
Yeah, no, there's still one marker that's 1996, I believe. And so it varies. And so, Durham has changed. And especially when I looked at this prediction model, when I first started, the prediction model, the way it was set up is that I should not have a kid with special needs. That's the way the prediction model reads. The fact that I have 2 is it's just amazing as far as this model. When I went through this model, I should not have any kids with special needs. So that's how well this is protected. But the other thing is that they look at the statistics, the new census data, there shows the increase of a variety of social factors, and they're just not reflected there. And then I also have to chuckle, Kelly just kind of started one too, but when you're looking at total amounts for the size of the board, the base amounts for some of these funding models is just ridiculous when we're considered, I think we're the 6th largest, or if not the 5th, it keeps on going up and down with their enrollment. So we hover in between there, board, and we still get the same base amounts as some of, and it's great for some of the smaller boards, still not enough, but still great. And then the fact that, the last fact is what you just said, is that great that we have great enrollment, but hey, I'm darn sure we're gonna have more students who would have more needs from special services, right? So, because we know that the impact is greater. We know that it's happening. We know that this is a growth board. We know that this board is attracting because of the services, community service like Grandview that is building. We know that we attract people because of that. And so just giving us a base amount for new enrollment while defeating as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, I'll stop my preaching, but that's just my thoughts. So when I go into the budget as a trustee, I always look at those considerations, and I'll always ask those questions to ensure that the public also knows just how much we do try to support, but it's still not enough.
I just have one question about, thank you.
She's a strong advocate, I love it. It's really important, because this is why we end up writing letters, and we try to, beg the government for more money, but, so in terms of the ECCP, I just wanted to understand, how that allocation program works, because, perfect.
The text, are you okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, ECPP, as Jen said, was Education Community Partnership Program. So in Durham, we refer to that as Grove School, so it's our day treatment partners.
Okay, great, yeah.
And so, you may remember a couple months ago, and I can recirculate it, we brought an update on
Yes.
Grove as part of the ISS impact
Yes.
update. And so when we look at each of the partnerships, at each of the program spaces, each of those program spaces is now an annual application cycle. It was we were doing it twice a year, and in the last year, we've moved to an annual cycle, which is Fabulous. We have to account for, so the Ministry of Education transfers the payment for the teacher salary for each of those program spaces at the exact grid placement of the teacher assigned to that classroom. So what we need to do, again, between the two teams, is that, based on teacher assignment, we have to declare the salary and benefits for every single program by program. And as Jen said, if there's any variance, that needs to be reported. So we have very experienced teachers through ECPP, and we have some who are newer in their career. The ones that are newer in their career are often coming from other career spaces with a background to support the kids, which is wonderful. But we do have to differentiate for all almost 50 plus teachers. There is also a base amount that based on being over a certain size. So for ECPPs, we are second in scope provincially. So Toronto is the only district that has a broader ECPP program. Niagara's is pretty big, London's is pretty big, or Thames, sorry. But we are second in size to DDSB. Based on the number of programs we run, we also are allocated an assumption of needing clerical and technology and things like that. And so we do get a minimum base amount, I believe it's like, and it's minimum, in terms of that into the program as well. And then for every 15 classroom spaces, you're funded an administrator. So in Durham, we translate the third role funding into one of the department heads, because we do feel it's important to have a guidance head with ECPP, given the number of transitions the kids make in to, through, and from the programs. And so we hold a principal, a vice principal, and then we do qualify for the funding. We reallocate it to serve the kids in Durham.
Okay.
So that they're well supported in that system, but that is Grove School and ECPP are synonymous. Within documentation, we refer to as ECPP, within kind of the experience of creating a school experience for the kids and for staff in terms of that connection, we umbrella it under Grove.
Okay, just a quick supplemental. So I'm just wondering if in the, I think that's the bargaining, oh yes, in the support for student funding, is there any way that could tie into the, can you share like if there was any additional funds into the ECPP or?
No, they come in on the GSN side.
Oh, okay, so it's totally separate, okay.
And I apologize, I'm trying to flip to get into where you are. No, it's considered separate. They're part of the central agreements provincially, and then brought in locally through the unions, and then in collaboration. And we're just in that process, rolling out some staffing and decisions based on that. But again, highly collaborative in Durham and putting the dollars right in permanent roles adjacent to kids within classrooms for learning and well-being.
Okay, thank you so much.
And so as Jen said, through the budget process, will be pretty declarative on where those dollars have gone, in consultation with the individual unions.
Yes. Yeah, Senator Aaron, go ahead.
My questions are about this,
Maybe slide number, and then I can switch.
sure, 16,
Thank you.
are about the special education reserve. I very much noted that you said finish, right? We made our last draw, right? There's a bunch of questions that float through my head. I'm gonna ask them all, no matter what the novice level or whatever level is, right? How often is our reserve empty? How does it get replenished? How does our reserve affect the deficit and that deficit number that we have? Does our reserve help to pay for that? And does that also mean we have, because it seems that we pay for a lot of stuff out of reserve, right? Even some of the casual things, like you said, oh, this is the base amount, but it requires more.
Yes.
How, can you tell me?
Sure, so when I say we have a special education deficit, what I mean by that is that the amount that we budget for expenditures is higher than the amount that we get specifically in revenues for special education. So not that the board as a whole will run a deficit, just that if we look at those enveloped dollars, we're running a deficit. So if that deficit per se doesn't impact our accumulated surplus.
So there's another surplus pocket.
So overall, we have a balanced budget as a board.
Okay,
It's just if you looked only at special education, revenues and expenses, we overspent on special education essentially. So how do we get money into reserve? It was an internally restricted funds from many years ago. They had put some money aside for special education, likely because they underspent in a year before my time. And so there was a need for these educational assistant positions. So it was decided that we would draw on this reserve to help support. This was a 3-year draw. So for the past 3 years, and that was planned. We knew this would be our last year. Now we've used all the money in that reserve, but the board as a whole actually still does have accumulated surplus.
so how often is this reserve empty? Do we have a plan of replenishing it? I heard the one-time funding.
Sure.
So the non-finance answer, and then general answer, the finance answer, is that on principle, we should not have the special education reserve, because special education reserves are framed off of money that was designated and provided for programs and services for students who had program needs. And so at some point, in order to get a reserve, you have to have underspending. And so we really try and with full credit to the Board of Trustees for the support in advance, more than the envelope. So it pulls from other areas in the year fund. That the principle of having money not spent on students that need programs and services from an integrity and principle standpoint should not occur. We do have one pocket of deferred revenue where we were underspent in terms of SEAC as we came through COVID, and we had a significant number of kids accessing from home. And so we did accumulate some reserve in SEAC, but what we have experienced is as kids have come back into in-person learning over the last few years, our expenses have actually gone more than projected, because we would have a regular cycle of new enrollments to the district or kids outgrowing equipment. When we had a higher volume who had not been through that regular replenish cycle, more kids needed upgrades to their equipment and sizing, and so it's kind of balanced out that way. But you do see us see a deferred revenue for that reason, we do try and balance it out, but in principle, we should not have a special education reserve because it means dollars designated. We're not, and so with school principals and their budget and within our district department budgets, in-year funding should be expended on students in that school year because that's what it's being designated for. And our principals try and do that, we try and do that as department. This year's dollars for this year's kids is kind of how it, in its most core, that's this year's allowance. And so in that, but we also knew a $500,000 infusion would be somewhat problematic. We had planned on not having it for the 23-24 school year. In advance, when we started planning for a drawdown on the reserve, we didn't factor in COVID. And then when COVID hit and boards received COVID-specific funding, we started balancing it out and figuring what supports and services could come from COVID dollars first, and then slow down the expenditure of the special education reserve, because we were never, Darren's part of our thinking at that time around the senior team table and then through to our trustees for approval was, if we're not assured how many years COVID would run, and if the COVID funding may or may not keep pace with that, the special education reserve was kind of a backup plan for if we needed augmentative support or where we would have higher transition rates. And so we were able to hold true to the intentionality of the articulation. It's been in the budget book for a few years. And so we did a slow drawdown, but we slowed down the drawdown. And that's where this year, without COVID funding, we still had reserve. And where Jen's identified, we did put in 8-week assignments to support transitions. So where classes opened and or we saw students come into the district to make sure that Connor and Michelle working with schools had a little flexibility for those unanticipated move-ins that we were able to support. But this year, we will not have the same flexibility this September because we have expended the reserve. with no plans to reaccumulate because it would be non-spent. That's the non-finance answer.
Better than the accounting.
No, it's not. I love the accounting answer. It's the one that keeps us in good step, but
Yeah.
this year's dollars for this year's kids.
Yeah.
Well, just an overall comment about budget. School boards are not allowed to have a deficit budget. If they do put in a deficit budget, it's a maximum of 1% of the budget, and they must put in a plan when they submit the budget. A deficit, basically, to pay back that deficit within the 1 year. So in other words, you really don't have any deficit. So that's a bigger, this year was the first year where we actually put in a plan with a deficit. And we had to pay that back, basically have to pay it back by the end of the fiscal year. And what plan we put into place, but that is, so this is the first time we've ever had to do it. My fear is exactly because of some of the things that are happening, we have no reserve in special education, agree there shouldn't be one there in principle, but we're running out of places to pull funding. When I first started SEAC, we actually had more money in transportation, and we used to pull over any unused funds for transportation to support. Well, we no longer have that anymore. Look at the cost of transportation and fuel costs that are keeping pace. The ministry is providing boards with fuel costs. That is happening there. Another 3 cents. This past weekend. So there's additional pressures as well.
This just makes me really angry every time we start talking about this.
I just get so angry.
Anybody else have any questions, comments?
Just a couple questions, just I guess for folks who haven't necessarily been around the budget thing. The term of the envelope funding, just defining that specifically for.
Yeah, so sometimes we get funding that has to be used for a specific purpose. So, for example, special education is the one that most people actually know. So all of our funding that we receive for special education must be used on special education. We can't, kind of what Donna was talking about, take some of that money and use it for transportation. So it's less flexible, which is good. It must be used for that purpose, but just kind of further to Donna's point, as they envelope more and more of our funds, it gives us less flexibility to divert funds to special education. So sometimes good, sometimes makes it a little more difficult if we have local priorities where we want to move that money around. So as things tighten up, it's becoming more and more difficult when I'm, talking about a $3 million overspend in special education, and all the other pots of money are enveloped or marked for a certain purpose, it becomes more and more difficult. So that's just some of the challenges that we're facing. And again, we don't have the GSS for this year, so I don't have a full story for you, but that's just a trend that we've been seeing over the past few years.
And historically, because I know the vast majority of the spec ed budget, budgeted dollars and revenues that we get, basically go towards paying salaries. Do we know it's like ridiculous, like 96%?
Correct, yes.
Something like that?
Impressive.
Yeah, it's really budget stuff plus, and it does ebb and flow, but it does in between like 95 to 98%.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing, is that the amount of money that we get, and it's like 1.8 billion.
No, we're in billions, we're in hundreds of millions.
We're hundreds of millions, but like, I think we're at like 700 million, I think, we talked about it, but like, we get a significant portion of that, and 96% of that just goes to staffing salaries. That's not service supports, that's not equipment, that's not sensory rooms, that's not SEA, that's not SIP, that's everything else, it's just the people. And I know the people are like one of the most critical points for service, providing service, but that's where your money's going. And we know that we get so little, and that's just for the people that we can afford. Like the conversation that we have had over the years in terms of the number of students that we have in the system, 18%, I think identified.
We consider about 15,000 on service
Yeah.
each year to the department
Right.
staff, both in schools and centrally.
Yeah, and our totals of our EAs are, under 1,000, over 15,000 students across the board. And just not even considering, like, what is that in terms of a percentage of, and you still have children who have high needs that need 2+. You still have children in small class placements that have multiple EAs in a classroom. What does it leave for the other children in the mainstream for those supports? That's just what we can afford to have in terms of number of bodies in the buildings. That's the part that really just, because that's not, we can do nothing else.
And just another comment is that every time the ministry comes around and questions are asked about special education, they make 2 points. One is that, oh, well, increase special education by X amount of dollars, but as Tara said, that increase is based on, includes those negotiated salary increases. So the 95% of that funding that they've increased is usually, or it's probably lower, but it's usually around staffing increase. And then the second thing they also say to you is that, but you choose to spend the money the way you want to provide the service you want. So in that respect, because we choose to have small class placements, which is a little bit more expensive to deliver, then we're choosing to spend that money that way. And it's like, it's a negative thing that we're looking at, when we look at accommodations and things that we're required to do around human rights and the Education Act, that says we must provide education. It goes against the grain, but those are the 2 standard answers that we get from the Ministry of Education. And it always riles me up because the general public do not understand that. They do not understand that because they're not here. And this is where the message here needs to make sure that we get to the parents to understand so that they can advocate effectively for saying, like, we need to do this in order to support.
Anybody else? Roll, go ahead.
First of all, I like to see numbers, so this is great. I like the numbers. I like to see the numbers, kind of know where we are. And I think we have some people that have sort of showed us what the lack of numbers mean. But sometimes I like to hear from the person who's working on it. What do you want to leave us with? That they're saying, guys, this is where we're in trouble, or I don't want to say trouble, but this is where we need support. Anything?
I think just truly the advocacy work that the trustees do, because I think the more the ministry hears from the boards that this is insufficient and we're not offering everything that we want to be offering as it is, and we're overspending the $3 million, and still, I think there's more that we could do. So I think just continue to be heard, because truly, I think everyone on senior team feels very strongly about supporting these initiatives, but as you can see from the numbers, there's already an overspend, and there really is one pot of money. So we do what we can do, and it's sometimes difficult.
Anybody else have anything?
Just that,
I think, sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, the ministry also has different definitions of seasons. That's all.
Sorry, and just to put it, so the ministry has committed to, special instance portion and specialized equipment allocation, audits of all of the districts, in the province. We are a 2024 audit board, which I think is a really, really proud of the integration that leads those processes and puts services into the experience of kids. And so the opportunity to talk about staff at schools, for them to, because part of the audit is a virtual connect on some inquiries and questions, and part of the audit is a school walkthrough with the ministry teams. They pick the schools, and so we're in the middle of that. We've done the virtual component, and in the next couple of weeks, we'll be heading out to schools. And I really do see it as an opportunity, because from the kids, who are wonderful, the staff that are adjacent to them in schools, right through to our clerical team members that do the ordering of the equipment based on regulated health recommendations. Sometimes that work isn't always highlighted, and so I think the audit's a really nice time to be able to highlight how it's all of the steps along that process that change the experience for kids and families. Within the process, again, having finished the first phase and going out to the second, one of the aspects I greatly appreciated was that it was conversational. A look at the funding models and ask for how they could be improved in service of kids. A look at the definition of what does complex mean. I think that's to a different table, and maybe the discrepancy of how complex is defined across different ministries is part of the challenge. But I really did feel like it was an invitation to a conversation for understanding that continued to place the students at the core of the conversation. So I left that with hope. I emailed Jen after, this is what we talked about. In that conversation, and I have shared with Jen and Associate Director Wright, I didn't think a conversation about special incidents portion, staffing, or equipment could sit outside of a conversation about capital priorities. And so we did bring that into the conversation as a growth enrollment board to say, putting staff into buildings beside kids and putting equipment into buildings for kids needs somewhere for that service and education to happen. And while we have a model for integrated support, regulated health professionals that are part of the district team, partnerships with partners such as Grandview, bringing OT, PT in, occupational therapy, physiotherapy supports, nursing supports into schools. I do believe schools are hubs. That service has to have somewhere to be placed. And so when I think of the work of social work and alongside students in mental health, clinical service, or psych, and a few of our other teams, that has to happen somewhere, not squished into a space. And when you're growth enrollment board, spaces that students with special education and strengths and needs draw on for sensory spaces, for breaks and spaces and gross movement, when you're a growth enrollment board at the crises kind of that we're building towards in terms of enrollment and where classes go, those spaces start getting taken. And so it starts impacting the strategies, goals, and opportunities for kids that need the different spaces to move and groove, both for their program and their services. So we did bring capital funding, budget, and funding into the conversation. So we started with SIP and C and said this is actually it is triangulated when you look at students with complexity of strengths and needs. It's the who's with them, how are they supported, and where does that support and programming happen. So I did email as I mentioned capital priorities within that conversation, but I do think it's important, as Jen said tonight, it's not one part of the budget in absence of any other part of the budget. It's a Jenga puzzle to make sure that we've got a really robust system of learning and well-being for students in Durham.
I think something else that you usually point out.
Oh, sorry, did I
No,
forget
no,
something?
good. Is that there are other aspects of the budget that support our special education students that aren't expressly highlighted here. Transportation, facilities, as often they will do major projects and buildings to support our students. So there are other ways that budget does support these students as well. But
so the overspend within the overall budget is actually greater than what's reflected. Because as Jen said, we're not the department as representative of programs and services is not charged back for all the spaces and places that student supports come from. And that includes a really strong teaching and learning commitment to universal design for learning and accommodation. As well, I would say the two department teams along with anti-oppression are probably at our strongest point of collaboration that I've experienced over the last decade in terms of that infusion of all students by all team members. which is really quite beautiful, and that includes our budget and finance team. Kudos to Jen. These aren't numbers for Jen, well, they are numbers for Jen in her role, but I've never had a conversation with Jen that hasn't had kids and students and experience embedded right now. So don't often get to publicly thank you, so we do so tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just have one last thought on this. I noticed yesterday watching the news that there was actually a protest in front of the TDSB school board offices, not directed at the TDSB, but parents who are starting to notice the lack of EA and are tying it to funding, and who are starting to see that this picture is that the boards don't want to provide it, is that the funding isn't there to provide it, and they're starting to notice, and that's a positive sign, because that's usually what makes movement, right? But, you know, we've been seeing it for a while around this table, especially those of us who've been around it for a long time. So, then thank you very much, really appreciate you coming out and sharing this information with us, because this is actually great the way it's laid out. So much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank you. Okay, we are going to move on then to business arising.
Oh, can I just?
Yes.
Public deputation, I don't, just.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think we have enough, anything useful to say as of April 16th.
Just a comment, that's kind of, that's a wish list. That's where we're basically, that's what that is expected, that's where what we want to see as far as where we want to. I would just call that a wish list, and I think that's really, really important to understand, so the trustees understand when we actually get the budget of where that is, so that's really important to start. That's what they're trying to do, the two budget process. One is like, this is what we want to include. And so this is really SEAC's wish list, where we want to see the money being spent. So please, you know, it's probably the same as we've done before, but, and then the second thing, of course, is that then it's a comment on the budget itself. So there's two different purposes for those declarations.
And we have a meeting before the May 28th one, right? So hopefully we'll have some sort of draft thing to look at, maybe.
Depends on the GSN's comment, there's a lot
Yeah,
of
but
work between the
GSN
GSN
and Senate committee.
release
No, I
and a draft budget going public.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. All right, so,
Okay, something that later.
okay. The business arising from the minutes, we have the Inclusive Student Services Special Education Plan, the SEAC section, where copies are also provided. And there's a clean copy and a black line copy.
So I hope that as Eva said, there's two versions. One is refreshed, I hope I reflected the quote well. And the other shows you the track changes from the current year version. So what we had discussed previously was to ensure that we were articulating a stronger connection for parents and caregivers in terms of what they could do and access. Since Brenda provided us with a quote, I'm wondering, Eva, you as chair? Okay, I'll double check, sorry.
I was looking for earlier today on my, I
will double check.
I might have sent it from my office email.
I'll check before I leave here.
Okay, but if not, I'll send you one tomorrow.
Thank you, and then a couple were just tidy up of order so that we could put the parents and caregivers more front end in the section, and then the logistics of when we meet further down. Based on your comments when we first looked at it, I thought you would want the parent caregivers prioritized and that other information as available. So happy to take any feedback on how you would like further changes. The SEAC brochure would be the most recent at the time, right before we submit for the board package. So that will be updated, later this spring. We'll hit it, knowing that we've got a drive for membership going right now. We'll pause on that and Lisa will insert it kind of last minute before it goes in the standing committee, package.
Does anybody have any questions with respect to this? No, go ahead.
I know that, you know, the special education plan basically is very prescribed what it should include. But one of the things that I still think that and although it's somewhat embedded in the first big recommendation of the board respecting matter affecting establishment developing, and I really think that one of the things that should be put in there is feedback on policy, board policy. Because that's really the effectiveness of this organization is this advisory committee. Because I think somewhere along the line, somewhere it does say that we are responsible for feedback on policy. I was gonna say policy procedures, but I know procedures not supposed to be, but.
And it is reflective of the minutes of SEAC over the last.
Yeah.
Like it is true to,
Yeah.
what comes forward to SEAC for advisory support. Thank you for that.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Kelly. Sorry.
I'm just wondering, and this is actually just so new for me in terms of just the changes and things that we've been doing for my term, but is there a reason why we don't have, in terms of reference, like a set of key terms?
So, so that would be, we can develop it. I agree that that would be a good move forward. It would not be reflected in this plan, because this is a chapter to the, overview of plan for programs and services for students. But we would definitely, if that's the will of SEAC, happy to pull some examples for other districts and bring them, and we can work through that. We have traditionally gone with a handbook, which we've talked a few times about updating. Just need a couple people with me to do that. But if SEAC was the will to develop terms of reference, I think that would be wise, but it would be outside of this document.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? With respect to it? Senator Net?
You are welcome to attend. It has an in-person address. We had a group of things.
Each of our meetings, there's an opportunity for in-person gallery to register.
Are we going to mention that we could also attend virtually?
We can do that.
Anybody else have any questions? Go ahead, yeah.
Can you take my phone number off? I'm the only person's phone number that's.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Of course.
You don't want a bunch of phone calls? You don't want a bunch of phone calls?
No, that's my personal.
I totally don't blame you. Anybody else? Rod?
Hey, I can speak afterwards, it's just a little gap in the, I realized I didn't see it the first time, but I can talk to Lisa.
The one question I had, so in attending two of the gifted orientation sessions last week, I actually looked to print off some of the old, just like, double-sided one kind of brochure, which we don't seem to have anymore, that just had a list of the associations.
Oh, for SEAC.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if we could have, like, this is great because it does give you far more information, but something, so when, like, for example, we're putting on a parents' night, an advocacy night, to be able to, an easy kind of one page as opposed to this multi-page thing, to sort of just break it down to associations and contact, but have this sort of, it almost set aside from it, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be in great detail, but it just, we got rid of that in place, I think, of this.
Partially for AODA with the amount of information that the associations wanted on it.
Right, yeah, exactly.
We do have it from the membership drive. We do have something that
Something that we
easily-
could,
yeah.
that we could create something that is printable and usable at functions, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because we've used that in the past, right? When we've had the welcome back barbecue in the past, we handed those kind of things out, and so it could be sort of a condensed version of this, but just for some reason, yeah. Jen, any more comments? No? Does anybody else have any comments or with respect to this right now? You know, if you want to take a little bit more time and sort of reply, sort of provide comments or whatever via email to myself or Andrea directly, then we can do that as well.
If we can confirm it on April 18th, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. So we need that, before April 18th. Right, and that sort of will allow anybody who wasn't able to attend tonight to provide some comments as well. Okay? Okay, if there are, just one last call for any questions or comments with respect to this plan. Okay, then we will move on to the SEAC advocacy transportation letter, which was also provided. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to review this, we're gonna take a few minutes and kind of read it over, provide comments back to Donna. On this one?
So I'm not gonna go through this details later tonight, let's get back to you with any
Okay.
comments tomorrow.
That would be great,
Yeah, that would be great.
because I want to give it like a proper read through for you.
Yeah, no, and it's just, we really need to get this out, especially right now, before your budgets are released, it's kind of crucial, as well as to get it into a package for trustees, but really, but opportunity time.
I'll get you some comments tomorrow. No, I'll take a look at it, okay?
Yeah. I could have read too fast, right? But I see an outline of all the things that they're doing wrong. But I don't necessarily see what our ask is, what we want them to do. All these points are fabulous.
Yeah, if you wish, I don't really have a summary of what our ask is, I agree, we don't have it in there,
Yeah.
and I was, I kind of left it because I wanted to know what our ask was from a committee point of view.
That's good, yeah.
Okay, so if you could tell me what your ask is, like.
Well, I would take them right out of the problems, right?
Yeah.
Like, this first paragraph on the back of the first page, when it talks about will there be considered in the route plan and provision for transportation services at a municipal level. We would like to have here at the table consultations so that we are considered at the transportation level. I think that we could pick them right out of the problems that you identified in each of these areas.
Okay, so on the, this is from the AODA side, they talk about the transportation standard. And it talks about, that school boards must, they must meet. So it's like transportation standard requires transportations to, so basically they have like, well, there's an established transportation standard for the equipments and vehicles accessible to passengers with disabilities, but I just wondered if, kind of feeding off of what, Cynthia had said, like, if there's something that we can say in there that in order to meet the standards, we need, like, something that.
The current thing is we are meeting the standards when it comes to, because the standards, if we read the K to 12 under transportation, it says we're meeting the standards, however, these are the things that are not being considered. And so it's the additional barriers, like the fact that when it comes to, the funding of the buses is one, but also because we're required to meet the transportation needs as a whole, when it comes to inclusion into programs becomes very difficult because we have Ajax, we have 4 tiers, that there's no timing that you can release a bus to have an excursion to a school with a wheelchair accessible bus, because they're all out already taking kids to school or back, or the time is so short, they can't get an excursion down to Toronto, and that's where they're going. So that's more of an issue, and there's a whole issue around the accessibility standards.
And can I just comment that, so I think in a sense, because we always try to find solutions for those areas where it goes outside, right? So I think maybe an extension of that in my mind that, well, in order to continue those services in adequately or efficiently, then we need to be able to make those, to have those, solutions, right? Like that are helpful, that they're efficient, that we're not doing this time it's consistent, right? So that everybody's needs get serviced. As you know, from our Ajax, so issues we've had very issues where maybe it's a private area or things that really go outside of the norm, and then we have to kind of look outside to connect with the city. So it's a challenge.
And I think I did put it, I said the DDSB, Special Education Advisory Committee, requests that the Ministry of Education, Municipal Affairs, and Housing and cooperatively investigate innovative public transportation initiatives that support all students specifically. So that's one of the asks that we ask, but I'm not as clear in there as far as actually having a seat at the table and things like that, right?
Yeah.
I think back to what you said here before, perhaps maybe if like people could submit something like we could get. It was good to discuss, but then maybe that would help. Yeah. Kind of like.
I mean, yeah, like, I'd like to see Durham Transit, take, sort of, I mean, this advocates for our students, but it advocates for people in the community in general with disabilities, right? Our students become community members, right? And hopefully independent community members. And what we wanna kind of stress to the Durham Region Transit is that failure to consider these people in their planning is essentially is a form of discrimination against these very individuals, right? So they're not only making it difficult for them to participate fairly and equally in society, but they're also putting themselves in a position of human rights complaints. And maybe that's kind of thing too, we should be stressing to them is that, this is a human rights issue. It's not, the ability to participate in society fairly and equally is a human right. It's part of human rights. So that's what I'd like to see. I think they should be taking that into consideration. I find that they've been very short-sighted in a lot of their views, like they don't take into account school times, right? Bell times. Very short-sighted. Those are your riders, right? That's ridership. You wonder why ridership is down? Well, ridership is down because buses are not convenient. This is not just for people with disabilities, it's in general. They've had the same attitude when it comes to coordinating with GO train schedules. Well, probably the biggest in Durham region, probably your biggest ridership for people going to and from GO train stations in Durham region. To not take that into consideration is ludicrous. It's idiocy as far as I'm concerned. It's just beyond me. It's beyond comprehension as far as I'm concerned. People start taking transit because you reduce the service. So then ridership is down, so you reduce service even more. And yet the municipality is growing. So what are they thinking here, right? Improve your service, improve accessibility on your service, more people will take it, ridership will increase. The municipality will grow and ridership will continue to grow. They have to stop thinking of it as small town transportation that maybe was adequate 30, 40 years ago. we're a growth area, right, in the GTA. The construct that's going to go up is huge, and they need to take that into consideration, so.
Yeah.
I think it's not just focusing on the rights of the students, but to rights of people with disabilities, period, and our students are among those people, right? So.
And Donna knows this because we were at one of the meetings, is how timing, like, you know, that affects their schedules, especially, you know, kids with special needs that run off a routine and depend on their schedule, and so the inconsistency is also why the numbers are down. So like, I would like to see more collaboration, because I think once they're hearing, you know, the user, they're hearing their voices, they're getting a little bit more understanding than just focusing on numbers. The numbers don't tell the whole story. So I definitely want to see more collaboration.
All right,
Like,
so,
opportunity to have conversations.
okay, so if people could provide their input, basically, and again, I would suggest that so that we have it ready for the meeting on the 18th. You could provide, so I can address the other comment I was just gonna ask is, or CCing this, is that as I said, I put this to the Minister of Education, and I was wondering if we wanted to actually put it to not only the Minister of Education, but also, or at least CC it to the other ministries I talked about. Because I did mention that in that paragraph about municipal affairs and housing and infrastructure being part of those discussions, right? So if I CC them, but I'm also, you know, when it comes to, the other one is, AMO, which is the Association for Municipalities of Ontario, is another option, from that perspective. And then we would also CC, the Ontario Public School Board Association, so that they know that, you know, we've set this out.
And the chairs of other municipalities. Or the chairs of other SEACs, right?
Yeah, the chairs of other CX, which is
The
the
usual
usual.
group everybody should get something.
Yeah, so those are just my suggestions, so again, if you can add those in, anybody else would be.
I'm just wondering if we should look at shadow ministers. On the, you know, for the opposition groups. NDP shadow minister for
Or
transportation.
education credits, you can do that.
Yeah, I think sometimes the best way to try and push education issues in general to the forefront is to sometimes give the underdog a bone. Right?
I'm just thinking, if we're looking at this, we can say Durham will be a pilot project.
Yeah.
And then, you know, establish this advisory committee, and we get working here, maybe we can get it working somewhere else. Right? I don't know, it's an option, something to
You
think
know,
about.
at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, you can't CC too many people if you're trying to get a point across, right? Especially when it comes to accessibility that affects the entire municipality, anybody within the municipality. So, yeah. Okay, so does anybody have any other questions or concerns with respect to that? So Donna needs any other comments ASAP? Okay, if there's no other questions or concerns, we're gonna move to adjourn this meeting. Motion to adjourn, Donna, seconded by Tara, all in favor?